How do we move past our stories? This one comes from Derek McMillan. Hi, Rich. In your podcast with James Altucher, you both touched on how we move past our stories rather than continuing to be identified with who we were, whether it be an addict, criminal, etc. How do you develop a positive relationship with your past without identifying with it in the present and letting it dictate who you will be in the future? Thanks.
That's like the ultimate question, right?
Yeah.
We all have these stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. You know, mine can be, I'm an alcoholic, or I'm an athlete. Yours could be, I'm a journalist.
Yep.
So those are the labels that we put, you know, there's professional labels, but there's also these more, at times insidious stories that we quietly, privately tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of. And
I can't do that
ways,
thing. I could never do that.
You know, well, Goggins can do that, but I can't do that because he's like that and I'm like this.
Right.
Right?
That's right.
I do it as much as anybody. I've done it historically over my whole life. And I think it's important to understand that these stories are illusion. We fabricate them. It's like our brains want to make sense of ourselves and our world and our past and our capabilities. It's like this mapping device, right? And it's trying to identify patterns. There was a spiritual teacher that I had many years ago, and he described it like buds on a branch. Like if you take a tree branch and you see the little buds where eventually there'll be new branches, right? And if you look at that branch like a timeline of your life, we have a tendency as human beings to identify these certain buds of things that have happened in our past, and we weave them together to construct a narrative, right? So it might be my father abused me, or you know, I wasn't able to get into college, or you know, whatever it is, right? Like there are certain instances, like events that occur, and we hone in on those and we create meaning around them, and then we weave them together. But in truth, our life is made up of billions of decisions and events that have occurred over the course of our lifetime. And we're myopic to almost all of it, except for these little buds along the branch, right? And we make this decision based on illusion that these things are more meaningful than everything else that's happened to us. And we construct an identity around that. And I think the process of learning from that, but not identifying with it, is one of self-inquiry. I think it's a lifetime journey of deconstructing that. And it begins with mindfulness, because the more that you can be present in your life, the less you are, the less you're shackled to that past, and that past as a predictor of future behavior, right? So the most tangible, tactical advice I can give to someone who's struggling with this is to begin meditating and to try to learn how to be more present in your life. I think these stories are important to the extent that they can inform a better path forward, but detrimental to the extent that we rely on them as limiters and predictors of future behavior. Your past doesn't dictate your future, but it will if you allow it to. And I think in most people's case, that's what happens. You just say, well, because I'm this way and this thing happened to me, that I can only do these things, or I'm not capable of doing these other things. And freedom comes with being in the present and unshackling from that narrative, deconstructing it, like really
being
doing
in the present,
inventory.
Meaning.
Well, the more you're present, the less reactive you are, and the less prone you are to just repeating some cycle, you know, that's some deep groove that's like in your brain about how you behave.
Because you're open to what's coming at you versus ready to defend against what's coming at you?
You can evaluate your circumstances more objectively rather than reacting impulsively to them based upon some prior, like when this happens, I always do this, right? I'm not even thinking, I just do it. This is how I respond to these situations. Yeah. And understanding that that's actually a choice, but in order to really embrace the fact that you have options, you need to be present to create that little buffer of time wherein you can reflect a little bit more deeply on what's happening, so that the behavior that you choose to then lean into is coming from a more reflective place as opposed to like an innate response, right? And I think if you do an inventory of your life, I would suggest people start with, what are those buds on your branch? Like, get out a notebook and write down all of those things that you think form your identity, those important events in your life that you think are formative. And then I would challenge you to then find other instances in your life that call into question the veracity of whatever truth is that you're hanging your hat on. And I would imagine that most people can find, like, I'm not worthy of being hired for this kind of job because I've been fired 3 times in a row. Well, have you ever had a job where you didn't get fired? Like, try to put truth to that lie in some regard, and understand that you have the power to create a new narrative. What you decide to focus on becomes your reality. So if you can free yourself from being overly focused on those buds along that branch and those instances that create this story, you have the power to create a new story for yourself.
What you decide to focus on becomes your reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the headline right there,
Right.
Like, our emotions, sometimes we feel like, there's right now especially, there's this idea of, I mean, I don't even mean in the context of the political situation right now. I just mean in this generation, and with so many people in therapy or whatever, you hear people saying, well, everyone wants to express their feelings, and their feelings become almost sacred. But not every emotion needs to be validated,
right?
And not every emotion is valid.
Mm-hmm.
It's you decide what emotions are valid,
right? And that's not to say that if you've suffered a certain trauma that you should pretend it didn't happen to you. If that's the case, that needs to be looked at. Like, seek out therapy, like unpack that. What's behind that? How is it holding you back? And start to develop tools to work through that so that it no longer carries that charge and that power that is inhibiting you.
What would be an example of that for you, where you had to move past a certain story in your life? Maybe, sobriety could be one, but maybe endurance sports. What was it for you that kind of like an example where you consciously moved in a different direction because you changed the story?
I think I can give you 2. I mean, one is where I'm still kind of very much in a story, and one is where I'm actively moving past a story. And the first is addiction and alcoholism is tricky, right? Because I am an alcoholic, and I think there's certain people who will tell you that they've cured themselves of alcoholism or they've transcended it, and it's not for me to judge that person's experience. Maybe they have, and if they have, that's fantastic. But I know that I have alcoholism and that I need to treat it, and that treatment involves 12-step and working with other alcoholics, et cetera. I have a whole 12-step program for dealing with this. I will never be cured of alcoholism, but that doesn't mean that the fact that I'm an alcoholic needs to define my entire life experience. It's something that I have to deal with, and my first priority as an alcoholic is to help other alcoholics achieve sobriety. Like, I'm clear on that. But that doesn't mean that I'm like this single issue person.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I do know people that are sober alcoholics, and basically their entire life is about, talking about the fact that they have alcoholism. Like, alcoholism is something that almost killed me, and there's a whole story behind that that I still hold on to. I don't allow it to identify who I am, but it's a very powerful story in the sense that it is a reminder that as much as I want to deny or ignore it, that I have a disease that would very much like me dead. And that I have to remain persistent in my recovery to abet that internal urge inside of me that's doing push-ups the minute I stop treating it.
Staying ahead of it.
Right. So that is a story that has truth to it. I don't overly identify with it, but I need to maintain the pertinence of that story in my life in order to be well. And that's why when you go to like an AA meeting, people get up to the podium and they share what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. And the reason that they share what it was like is a reminder to themselves as they're sharing it and to everyone else, like, this is where I came from. Like, this is why I do all these things now, because I would very much like to just forget that I did all of those things and pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And it's important that I'm reminded that that is, fundamentally who I was and who I could return to being if I'm not vigilant. So that would be that one example of where I maintain a connection to this story for a healthy reason.
Yep.
Another example would be this pivot that we're making with the podcast right now. It would be very easy for me to just say, well, I'm this endurance athlete and I'm a vegan and I do a podcast about those issues. We're going to talk about nutrition and how to be like an Ironman triathlete or whatever, and like, stay in your lane, Rich. Trust me, I'm on the receiving end of a lot of stay in your lane comments these days.
Which is weird because your lane has always been pretty wide.
There's a lot of people who would very much like me to go back to that lane and stay there.
They want the triathlete podcast.
That's a story that's powerful. Like, I could just stay in this place of like, oh, I did 5 Ironmans on 5 Hawaiian Islands and tell that story again and again and again, and allow that to kind of dictate how I communicate publicly.
Yeah.
I'm not that interested in that. That was a while ago. Like, I'm in a different place right now where, I've grown. I still am an endurance athlete and I love all that stuff, but it's important to evolve, right? And we're trying to evolve the podcast a little bit right now by doing what we're doing right now. And I don't want to allow that story of who I was to dictate what I have to be in the future. That story is powerful and I can leverage it as a way of reminding me that I'm capable of putting anything I put my mind to. Yeah. Because I've done some hard things. I know that I'm capable of more than that other old story tells me, which is that, I'm not good and I'm in imposter syndrome. I know there's another question about that we can get into. Yep. So I use those stories for the benefit that they can give me, but I don't allow them to hinder me from growth, if that makes sense. Yeah. Do you think that answers this question?
It totally makes sense. I think it does. The idea that we should be focused on not what we did, but where we're going. Not where we've been, but where we're going. But the reason I think people love that story also is because the story of your Rich Roll, the endurance athlete, is because to so many of your listeners, they would like to get to the point where they have kind of some sort of physical mastery or get better. And because it's interesting, would you be at the place you are now if you hadn't gone through the crucible of ultra, which allowed you to see yourself? Like you talk about meditation. I don't know if you meditate daily or not, but comparing that to what you learn about yourself in an ultra, it must be, those are kind of, they're not just buds on the branch, they're kind of,
they're formative experiences.
Yeah, they're like, what do you, like, I'm spacing on the word in India, like a yoga, like where people come, an ashram. They're kind of like the ashram of the mind in a way, and body.
Yeah, I mean, I've always, and I'm happy to talk about all those things because I want everybody to have their version of that experience that I had for myself because it was so formative. So endurance sports will always remain, a heart place on this show. Like, I love talking to endurance athletes and exploring the teachings of that pursuit, right? But I would also say that I got into endurance sports to learn more about myself, not to just become an endurance athlete. It wasn't about podiums and winning races and all of that. And also wasn't about, being a competitive athlete for the rest of my life. Like, I wanted to more deeply connect with who I am so that I could be more authentic in my expression of myself. And as a result of having that experience, I learned a lot about myself, and I'm committed to continually growing and evolving rather than just doing this one thing, staying in my lane and, pleasing a certain number of people. Because what's the point if you're not going to continue to get outside of your comfort zone, challenge yourself and grow? And
the point of pushing the comfort zone is to remind yourself or learn the lesson over and over again that I can be more than I thought I was, right? There's more to me.
And that empowers the ability to, transcend those stories that hold you back.
Exactly. So it's like a feedback loop.
Right. It's it's a positive feedback
loop. It's a positive feedback loop. And that plays into, I don't know, Angela Davis, legendary Black Panther and an activist for decades. I saw a quote from her this week, and it was something like, I constantly can be an activist because I'm always because I'm positive we are going to get there. I'm positive it's going to change. There is
an optimism
to it, knowing that it will happen. And I think that there's a parallel here as well. Moving past the story, you can move past the story when you know there's another place to go.
Right, and that begins, just to cap it off, and we'll move on to the next story. Like, that begins with mindfulness practices, but it also, I would say, a close cousin to that is commit yourself to doing something that contravenes whatever that story is, even if it's a tiny, small win. Create that little goal that would put into question the veracity of whatever story you're telling yourself. And with that small win, you can then build on it and ultimately, crater the sandcastle of that imaginary story that you've been telling yourself your whole life that's holding you back.
I love that.